Grain dust hung in the morning air of the lower market, thick enough to taste. Merchants shouted over each other, trying to sell the last of the season's harvest before the heat of the day set in. Among the noise and the crowded stalls stood Tobias Wren, a thin young man with rough hands and dried mud on his boots. He was not there to watch dragons hatch. He was there to sell 3 sacks of barley and buy medicine for his younger sister. Tobias lived at the edge of the kingdom of Aldenmore on a small farm that barely fed his family. His parents had died 2 winters ago, leaving him to raise his brother Combe, who was 10, and his sister Myra, who was 7 and often sick with fever. Every coin mattered. Every sack of grain mattered. He had walked 3 hours to reach the capital that morning, and he planned to walk 3 hours back before dark. The market square was busier than usual. Flags hung from every window, painted with the royal crest of a coiled dragon. Vendors whispered about the ceremony that would take place at midday, the grand selection, held only once in a generation. Tobias had heard of it the way a farmer hears of things far above his life, like a distant storm that never actually reaches his fields. Dragons would hatch today in front of the king, and they would choose their bonded riders from among the noble families gathered at the palace steps. He did not care much for dragons or nobles. He cared about selling his barley at a fair price, but by mid-morning, the market began to empty. Merchants packed up early, guards ushered the crowd toward the palace square, and Tobias found himself swept along with the current of bodies before he could push his way free. He told himself he would watch for a few minutes and then slip away to find a buyer for his grain elsewhere. The palace square was enormous, paved with pale stone that had been polished by centuries of feet. At its center stood a raised platform, and on that platform sat a stone nest holding a dozen large eggs, each one shimmering faintly with color, some blue, some red, some the deep green of moss after rain. Around the platform stood the noble families of Aldenmore, dressed in silk and polished armor, each hoping their son or daughter would be chosen. Commoners like Tobias were held far back behind wooden barricades and rows of guards in shining breastplates. King Aldrich sat upon a raised chair near the platform, an older man with tired eyes and a heavy golden crown. Beside him stood Lord Harvard, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, his chest puffed out with pride as he watched his son Edrin stand among the chosen candidates. Edrin was tall, confident, and dressed in the finest armor money could buy. Everyone expected one of the eggs to choose him. It was, after all, tradition. Dragons always chose strength, wealth, and noble blood. No commoner had ever been chosen in the long history of the kingdom. Tobias stood near the back of the crowd, barely able to see over the shoulders of the people in front of him. He shifted his sacks of barley onto one shoulder and tried to catch a glimpse of the platform. Around him, people murmured predictions. Some said the strongest egg would choose Edrin. Others whispered about a young duchess from the eastern provinces who had trained with dragon scholars since childhood. No one mentioned Tobias, because no one knew his name and no one cared. A hush fell over the square as a royal priestess stepped onto the platform. She raised her arms and began a slow, chanting prayer in the old language, words that Tobias did not understand, but that made the hair on his arms stand up. The eggs in the stone nest began to shake, ever so slightly at first, then harder, rocking against each other with soft, clicking sounds. Cracks spread across their shells like frost creeping over glass. The crowd leaned forward as one. Even the guards seemed to hold their breath. Lord Harvard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, whispering something that made Edrin straighten his back even further. King Aldrich rose slowly from his chair, his eyes fixed on the nest. Tobias, still near the back, felt a strange pull in his chest, though he told himself it was only nerves from the crowd pressing in around him. He shifted his weight and adjusted his grip on the barley sacks, thinking that once this was over, he could finally find a buyer and start the long walk home before Myra's fever worsened. He had no reason to believe any of this concerned him. The first egg cracked open with a sharp sound, and a small golden head poked out, blinking in the bright sunlight. The crowd gasped. A second egg split apart moments later, revealing a hatchling with scales the color of dark iron. Then a third, then a fourth, each one stumbling free of its shell on wobbling legs, shaking off bits of broken shell like water after rain. The nobles on the platform straightened, ready to be chosen, ready to kneel and accept whichever hatchling approached them. Lord Harvard's smile widened as one small dragon, deep red like a burning coal, turned its head toward his son. Everyone expected the choosing to follow the old pattern, exactly as it always had. No one in that square, not the king, not the priestess, not Lord Harvard, and certainly not Tobias himself, had any idea that within moments, everything they believed about dragons, nobility, and destiny was about to be shattered in front of the entire kingdom. The red hatchling took one step toward Edrin, then it stopped. Its small head tilted, nostrils flaring, and it turned instead toward the crowd behind the barricades, toward the sea of common faces who had come only to watch. Its eyes swept over merchants, farmers, and laborers until they landed, impossibly, on a thin young man carrying 2 sacks of barley, standing at the very back of the square. A ripple of confused muttering spread through the crowd as the red hatchling took a wobbling step away from the platform. Guards near the barricade exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to stop it or let it pass. The little dragon ignored them all. It scrambled down from the platform, half falling, half flying on wings too small to lift its own weight, and began crawling straight toward the back of the square. Lord Harvard's smile froze on his face. His son Edrin, still standing with his hand outstretched, looked down at the space where the dragon should have been and found nothing but empty air. Whispers turned into open gasps as people realized what was happening. The hatchling was not choosing a noble. It was choosing someone in the crowd. Tobias felt his stomach twist into a knot. He looked left and right, certain the dragon was heading toward someone else, some important person standing near him that he had not noticed. But the people around him began stepping back, clearing a path, staring at him with wide eyes. The red hatchling reached the barricade, squeezed between 2 wooden beams, and climbed straight up Tobias's leg before he could even drop his sacks of barley. He froze, arms still full of grain, as the small dragon settled itself against his chest and let out a soft, satisfied chirp. Its scales were warm, warmer than anything should be that had just hatched from an egg. Tobias stared down at it, his mind blank with shock, unable to form a single word. Before anyone could recover from that surprise, a second hatchling, the one with iron-dark scales, tumbled off the platform and followed the same path. It moved faster than the first, weaving between the legs of stunned nobles and guards, until it too reached the barricade and pushed through. It climbed up Tobias's other side, wrapping its tail around his arm. The entire square had gone silent, except for scattered whispers of disbelief. King Aldrich rose fully from his chair now, his tired eyes sharp with alarm. Lord Harvard's face had turned an ugly shade of red, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to crack. Edrin stood frozen on the platform, humiliated in front of the entire court, his outstretched hand now lowered slowly to his side. Then came the third hatchling, a smaller one with pale grey scales that shimmered faintly like storm clouds. It did not run or stumble like the others. It walked calmly, almost proudly, straight down the platform steps, through the parting crowd, and up to Tobias, where it settled at his feet and looked up at him with bright, curious eyes. 3 dragons, all 3 had chosen the same person, and that person was not a prince, not a duke, not even a minor lord's son. He was a farmer nobody in the crowd could name. Guards rushed forward, unsure whether to protect Tobias or drag him away. The royal priestess hurried down from the platform, her chanting forgotten, her face pale with confusion. She reached Tobias first, kneeling to examine the hatchlings clinging to him, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the red one's scales. "This has never happened," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Not once, not in the recorded history of the Grand Selection." King Aldrich descended from his chair and walked toward the barricade himself, something he had not done in years. He studied Tobias with narrowed eyes, taking in the plain clothes, the mud on his boots, the sacks of barley now abandoned on the ground. "What is your name?" the king asked, his voice carrying easily across the silent square. "Tobias, your majesty," he managed to say, his voice shaking. "Tobias Wren, I am a farmer. I only came to sell grain." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the nobles. Lord Harvard stepped forward, unable to contain himself any longer. "This is absurd," he snapped. "The boy has bewitched them somehow or tricked them. Take the dragons from him and bring them to my son, where they belong." The priestess shook her head slowly, still kneeling beside the hatchlings. "It does not work that way, my lord. A dragon's bond, once formed, cannot be broken by force. Not by kings, not by priests, not by anyone. If these three have chosen him, then he is theirs, and they are his, until death parts them." Lord Harvard's face twisted with fury, but even he knew the old laws well enough not to argue further in front of the king. He turned on his heel and stormed back toward the platform, dragging his humiliated son along with him. Tobias barely heard any of it. He was still staring down at the three small dragons wrapped around him, his mind struggling to accept what had just happened. He tried weakly to speak up. "There must be some mistake," he said. "I cannot care for dragons. I can barely feed my own family. Please choose someone else. Choose a lord, choose a knight, anyone but me." But the red hatchling only pressed closer against his chest, and the grey one nuzzled against his ankle, and the iron dark one tightened its tail around his arm, as if they understood his words and refused every one of them. King Aldrich studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though making a decision he did not fully understand himself. "The bond is made," he said. "Whatever this means, whatever it changes, it cannot be undone. Take the boy to the palace healers, see that the hatchlings are fed, and then let him return home if that is his wish." That evening, Tobias walked out through the palace gates as the sun sank low over Aldenmore, no longer just a poor farmer carrying empty grain sacks, but a man walking home with 3 baby dragons trailing behind him, uncertain of what his life had just become. Combe heard the strange noises outside before he saw anything, a mix of chirping, flapping, and heavy footsteps coming up the dirt path toward the farmhouse. He grabbed the old wooden broom by the door, the closest thing to a weapon he owned, and cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. What he saw made him drop the broom entirely. His older brother was walking up the path in the fading evening light, with 3 small dragons following close behind him like ducklings trailing their mother. Comb's mouth fell open. He turned and shouted for Myra, who came stumbling out from the back room, still wrapped in a blanket, her face pale from fever, but her eyes wide with curiosity the moment she saw the creatures in the yard. "Are those real dragons?" Myra asked, stepping closer despite Comb's attempt to pull her back. "They chose me," Tobias said, still sounding as though he did not quite believe his own words. "At the grand selection, I do not understand it either." That night the small farmhouse felt more crowded than it ever had. The red hatchling, restless and stubborn, kept trying to climb onto the kitchen table until Tobias finally gave up and let it sit there, watching him with sharp golden eyes while he cooked a thin vegetable stew. The iron dark one, quieter and calmer, curled up near the hearth, close enough to the fire that its scales seemed to soak in the warmth like a stone left in the sun. The pale grey one wandered the small house from corner to corner, sniffing at everything, before finally settling near Myra's bed as though sensing she needed watching over. Over the following days, Tobias gave the 3 hatchlings names, choosing them from the things he noticed most about their nature rather than anything grand or poetic. The red one, always drawn to the hearth fire and always the first to cause trouble, he named Flint. The iron dark one, steady and patient, content to sit for hours near the earth and stone of the farmyard, he named Marrow. The pale grey one, who loved to watch the sky and grew restless whenever clouds gathered, he named Squall. Word of what had happened at the grand selection spread quickly, even to the quiet farming villages far from the capital. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Tobias before suddenly found reasons to visit, some out of genuine curiosity, others hopping to see the dragons for themselves. A few, mostly older villagers who remembered harder times, offered him quiet encouragement, telling him that perhaps the dragons saw something in him that the nobles never could. Others were less kind, whispering that a farmer had no business raising creatures meant for kings, that something was bound to go wrong. The whispers reached the capital as well, and it did not take long for Lord Harvard to act. Less than 2 weeks after the selection, a finely dressed messenger arrived at the farm on a tall horse, carrying a sealed letter with the Harvard family crest. The letter, written in careful, polite language, suggested that Tobias would be doing the kingdom a great service by sending the 3 hatchlings to the palace, where they could receive proper training from experienced handlers, rather than being raised on a simple farm, lacking the necessary resources. Tobias read the letter twice, standing in his doorway while Flint tugged impatiently at his sleeve. He thought of Lord Harvard's furious face at the selection, and he understood immediately what the letter really meant. It was not concern for the dragons. It was an attempt to take from him what tradition said should never have been his in the first place. He wrote back a short, respectful refusal, explaining that the dragons had chosen him and that the old laws, as the palace priestess herself had said, did not allow the bond to be broken. He hoped that would be the end of it. It was not. Over the following weeks, more visitors came, some polite, some less so. A pair of Lord Harvard's men arrived one afternoon while Tobias was repairing a fence, asking pointed questions about how he planned to feed and shelter the dragons through the coming winter, hinting that failure to provide properly for them might be seen as neglect worth reporting to the crown. Tobias answered them evenly, though his hands shook with quiet anger long after they left. Despite the pressure, something remarkable was happening on the small farm that no noble scholar could have predicted. The three dragons were growing faster than seemed natural, their scales thickening, their small wings strengthening day by day. More than that, they followed Tobias everywhere, watching him work, mimicking the patience he showed while mending tools or tending the fields. When Myra's fever worsened one night, Marrow curled protectively around her bed and refused to move until her temperature finally broke by morning. When Combs struggled to lift a heavy sack of feed, Flint nudged it forward with his snout, as if trying to help despite being far too small to actually carry any weight. Tobias began to understand, slowly, and without fully admitting it to himself, that whatever the dragons had sensed in him at the selection, it was not something that could be taught in a palace classroom. It was something built from years of caring for people with almost nothing, of showing up every single day, even when there was no reward for doing so. By the time the first frost of winter settled over the fields, the farmer nobody in the capital had known by name had become the subject of quiet legend in villages across the kingdom. A man raising three dragons with nothing but patience, hard work, and a stubborn refusal to give up what had chosen him, no matter how many powerful people wanted it taken away. Sawdust drifted through the cold morning air as Tobias hammered another plank into place, building a shelter large enough to hold three dragons who were no longer the size of house cats. Nearly a year had passed since the grand selection, and Flint, Marrow, and Squall had grown to the size of horses, their wings now strong enough to lift them well above the treeline, their scales hardened into something closer to armor than skin. Feeding three growing dragons on a farmer's income should have been impossible. Tobias had no gold to buy the rich meats that palace-bonded dragons were said to eat. No trained handlers to teach him the proper methods described in old books he had never even seen. Instead, he relied on what he knew best, patience and problem-solving learned from years of scraping by on very little. He built the shelter himself from old timber and stone gathered from the edges of his fields, shaping it into a low, wide structure that kept out the wind while giving the dragons room to stretch their growing wings. He traded extra vegetables with neighboring farms for scraps of meat that larger households could not use, and he taught the dragons to hunt small game in the nearby woods, turning what might have been a burden into a shared task that strengthened their bond even further. Marrow, true to his steady nature, proved to be the strongest of the three, capable of hauling fallen logs and heavy stones that would have taken Tobias and Combe an entire day to move alone. Flint, still stubborn and quick-tempered, learned to control small bursts of flame, useful for clearing brush from the fields, though Tobias often had to remind him not to scorch the fences in the process. Squall, restless as ever, spent hours soaring above the farm, and villagers soon noticed that storms seemed to calm whenever the grey dragon flew through them, as though the weather itself recognized a kindred spirit. Word continued to spread, and slowly, grudging respect began to replace ridicule. Merchants who once laughed at the idea of a farmer raising dragons now traveled from distant towns just to see Flint clear a field in minutes or watch Marrow lift a fallen tree with ease. Even a few of the palace's own dragon scholars visited quietly, careful not to draw Lord Harvard's attention, and left the farm shaking their heads in disbelief at how quickly the three dragons had grown compared to their noble bonded cousins back in the capital. That comparison, though flattering to Tobias, carried an uncomfortable truth beneath it. Reports had begun arriving from travelers and traders about the state of the palace's own dragon riders, the sons and daughters of nobles who had been chosen at the very same grand selection. Training was proceeding, but slowly, and with far less enthusiasm than the old stories described. Edrin, Lord Harvard's son, had eventually been given a dragon from a smaller, later clutch, but those who saw the pair together spoke of a bond that felt distant, more like ownership than partnership. The dragon obeyed commands, but reluctantly, without the eager loyalty that Flint, Marrow, and Squall showed toward Tobias every single day. Late one evening, as autumn turned toward another cold season, a traveling trader stopped at the farm to trade cloth for grain and stayed longer than usual to share news from the northern borders. He spoke in a hushed voice, glancing over his shoulder out of habit, about strange happenings near the mountain passes, villages finding their livestock slaughtered overnight, entire fields left blackened as though touched by some unnatural rot. Some blamed raiders. Others whispered an older, more frightening name, one that had not been spoken seriously in generations, the Hollow Host. Tobias had heard the name only once before, buried in an old storybook his mother used to read to him as a child, describing an ancient enemy that had nearly destroyed the kingdom centuries ago before vanishing into legend. He had assumed, like most people, that it was nothing more than a tale meant to frighten children into behaving. But the trader's voice carried real fear, not the practiced tone of a storyteller. That night, after the trader had gone and Combe and Myra were asleep, Tobias sat outside the new shelter with Squall curled beside him, watching the stars. Marrow rested nearby, his heavy breathing slow and steady, while Flint dozed near the last embers of a small fire. Tobias found himself thinking not of his own farm or his own worries for once, but of the villages up north, of families who might be facing something far worse than a bad harvest or a harsh winter. He told himself it was not his concern, that whatever gathered in the northern mountains was a matter for the king's army and the palace's own dragon riders to handle. He had 3 dragons and 2 younger siblings depending on him, and that responsibility alone felt like more than enough for one farmer to carry. Yet as he looked at Flint, Marrow, and Squall, each one grown strong and fiercely loyal under his humble care, he could not shake a quiet, uneasy feeling that his simple life on the edge of the kingdom was not going to stay simple for much longer. Somewhere beyond the mountains, in the growing dark, something ancient was stirring, and the palace's celebrated dragons, raised on privilege rather than trust, might not be ready to face it. A horse arrived at full gallop just after dawn, its rider slumped forward with exhaustion, mud splattered across a torn royal uniform. Combe spotted him first from the fence line and shouted for Tobias, who dropped his tools and ran to meet the messenger before the man had even fully stopped his horse. "The king requests you," the messenger gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The northern border has fallen, the Hollow Host marches toward the capital, and the palace dragons cannot hold them back." The words hit Tobias like a blow. He had spent the past few months trying to convince himself that the rumors from the trader were exaggerated, that the king's forces and the noble bonded dragons would surely be enough to handle whatever threat existed beyond the mountains. But the messenger's face told a different story, pale and haunted in a way that no exaggeration could fake. "Why me?" Tobias asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. There must be dozens of trained riders closer to the front. The messenger shook his head. 3 of them fled during the first battle. Their dragons refused to fight, panicked, and turned back toward the capital instead of forward. Lord Harvard's own son barely escaped with his life. The king has ordered every bonded rider in the kingdom to report for the defense of the capital, and that includes you, farmer or not. Tobias looked back toward the farmhouse, where Myra stood in the doorway, worry etched across her young face, and Combe stood beside her, trying to look braver than he felt. Flint, Marrow, and Squall, sensing the tension in the air, had already gathered near the fence, watching Tobias with alert, waiting eyes, as though they understood exactly what was being asked of them. He thought of refusing. He thought of every reason why this was not his fight, why a farmer with two younger siblings to protect had no business marching toward an ancient enemy that had already broken trained knights and noble-bonded dragons alike. But he also thought of the villages up north, the families whose homes had already been destroyed, and the ones further south who would suffer next if the capital fell. "I need to arrange for my brother and sister to stay somewhere safe," Tobias said finally. "Then I will come." Within 2 days, with Combe and Myra settled with a trusted neighboring family and a promise to return, Tobias rode toward the capital with Flint, Marrow, and Squall flying above him, drawing startled stares from every village they passed. News of the farmer and his 3 dragons had spread far enough that people lined the roads simply to watch them go by, some cheering, others merely staring in stunned silence. The capital, when he finally arrived, looked nothing like the proud city he remembered from the grand selection. Smoke rose from the northern districts where refugees had crowded in, seeking shelter behind the capital's walls. Soldiers moved with grim, hurried steps, and the once confident nobility now wore expressions of barely hidden fear. King Aldrich, visibly older and more tired than the last time Tobias had seen him, met him personally at the palace gates. "The Hollow Host does not fight like an ordinary army," the king explained, leading Tobias through hallways lined with worried advisors. "They do not tire, they do not retreat, and they seem to feed on fear itself, growing stronger wherever panic spreads. Our noble bonded dragons, raised for parades and displays of wealth rather than true battle, have proven unprepared for an enemy that gives them nothing to command and everything to fear." Lord Harvard was present as well, though his usual arrogance had been replaced by something closer to desperation. His son Edrin stood beside him, bandaged from injuries sustained during the retreat, his once confident posture now hunched and shaken. When Harvard's eyes met Tobias's, there was no attempt at another scheme, no lingering insult about farmers and dragons. There was only the quiet, humiliating understanding that the very bond he had tried to steal or destroy might now be the kingdom's last real hope. That evening, as the sun set behind smoke-stained skis, Tobias walked the outer walls with Flint, Marrow, and Squall beside him, studying the darkened horizon where the Hollow Host was said to be gathering for a final push toward the capital. Soldiers along the wall watched him pass, murmuring among themselves, some with hope, others with open doubt that one farmer and 3 dragons could succeed where trained knights and noble riders had already failed. Tobias did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man far from home, worried about his siblings, uncertain whether tomorrow would end in victory or disaster. But as Marrow pressed close against his side, as Flint's low growl rumbled with something that felt almost like determination, and as Squall's sharp eyes scanned the darkening sky without a trace of fear, Tobias understood something the palace's scholars had never truly grasped about the bond between dragon and rider. It was not built from wealth, titles, or grand ceremonies. It was built from years of trust, patience, and genuine care, the same qualities that had raised 3 ordinary hatchlings into dragons capable of facing an enemy that ancient legends had once called unstoppable. As the first horns sounded in the distance, signaling the approach of the Hollow Host, Tobias took a steady breath, climbed onto Marrow's broad back, and prepared to find out whether that trust would be enough to save the kingdom. Fire lit the northern sky long before the Hollow Host reached the capital's outer walls, an unnatural glow that cast twisted shadows across the fields below. The enemy did not march like a normal army. They flowed like a dark tide, shapes twisted and wrong, moving without the noise of marching feet or shouted orders, only a low, constant murmur that seemed to seep into the minds of everyone who heard it, whispering doubt and fear into even the bravest soldiers along the wall. Tobias felt that whisper too, a cold pressure at the edge of his thoughts, but Marrow's steady presence beneath him and Flint's low, defiant growl in the air above helped push it back. Squalls circled high overhead, scouting the enemy's movement, occasionally diving low to warn of shifting attacks before they reached the wall. The first wave struck just after midnight. Twisted shapes surged toward the capital's gates, and for a moment, panic rippled through the defenders, exactly as the Hollow Host seemed to feed on. Several noble bonded dragons, still recovering from their earlier defeat, hesitated at the walls, their riders shouting commands that went unheeded as the dragons shrank back from the approaching darkness. It was Marrow who moved first, without waiting for orders, stepping forward along the wall to plant himself directly in the enemy's path. His thick hide, hardened over months of honest farm work and hard living rather than pampered comfort, absorbed blows that would have staggered a lesser creature. Behind him, Tobias shouted encouragement to the wavering soldiers, his voice steady despite his pounding heart, reminding them that the wall had held before and would hold again. Flint struck next, sweeping low along the enemy's flank with bursts of fire that scattered the twisted shapes trying to climb the outer defenses. Unlike the controlled, ceremonial fire the palace dragons had been trained to display at royal celebrations, Flint's flames carried the same stubborn, protective anger he had shown as a hatchling guarding Myra's sickbed, fierce and unwilling to yield an inch of ground. High above, Squall dove through the enemy's ranks, storm winds gathering around her wings, scattering the unnatural fog the hollow host used to mask their movements. With the fog lifted, archers along the wall could finally see their targets clearly, and the tide of the battle began slowly to shift. Word of the farmers' dragons holding the northern wall spread quickly among the capital's defenders, and something remarkable happened. The wavering noble-bonded dragons, seeing Marrow, Flint, and Squall fight without hesitation, began to find their own courage again. Riders who moments earlier had struggled to control their frightened mounts now pressed forward alongside Tobias, drawing strength from an example that no royal training manual had ever managed to teach them. Even Edrin, still bandaged from his earlier wounds, climbed atop his own dragon and joined the fight, no longer trying to prove himself better than a farmer, but simply trying to protect the same city and the same people. Lord Harvard watched from the palace walls, his earlier arrogance long forgotten, replaced by the quiet, humbling realization that his son's survival, and perhaps the kingdom's survival, now depended on the very bond he had once tried to destroy. The battle raged through the night, brutal and exhausting, but as dawn finally broke over the horizon, the twisted shapes of the hollow host began to retreat, unable to withstand defenders who no longer fought with fear, but with the same fierce loyalty that Tobias had shown his family for years. By the time the sun fully rose, the enemy had scattered back toward the northern mountains, driven off not by superior weapons or noble bloodlines, but by trust built through patience and genuine care. King Aldrich stood before the entire court 3 days later, once the wounded had been tended and the capital's defenses restored. He called Tobias forward, not as a farmer standing at the edge of a crowd, but as the man whose loyalty and courage had held the wall when trained knights and noble riders had faltered. For generations, the king said, his voice carrying across the same square where the grand selection had taken place a year earlier, we believed dragons chose strength, wealth, and noble blood. We were wrong. They choose loyalty. They choose kindness. They choose the kind of heart that shows up every single day, even when there is no reward for doing so. Lord Harvard, standing near the front of the gathered nobles, said nothing, his earlier schemes and insults now a source of quiet shame rather than pride. The king offered Tobias a noble title, land within the capital, and a place among the kingdom's honored riders. Tobias considered the offer carefully, standing beside Flint, Marrow, and Squall, who waited patiently at his side as they always had. In the end, he declined the title, though he accepted the king's gratitude with a respectful bow. His home was not the capital, with its polished stone and noble expectations. His home was the small farm at the edge of the kingdom, where Combe and Myra were waiting for him, where the fields still needed tending, and where 3 dragons had first learned what real loyalty looked like. As Tobias rode home with Flint, Marrow, and Squall flying above the road, villagers along the way came out to watch, no longer whispering about the strange farmer who had been chosen by mistake, but telling stories, already growing into legend, of the poor farmer whose kindness had saved a kingdom that had once thought him unworthy of a single dragon, let alone 3.